Who was Muhammad? The man behind the faith that rules Iran. The name Muhammad is everywhere, carved into mosque domes and woven into national histories. It echoes in sermons, law, and statecraft across the Middle East. To understand modern Iran, to trace how a distinct Persian civilization came to be shaped by an Arabian revelation, we must begin with the life of one man whose journey moved from a solitary cave to the leadership of a nascent polity. This is not a hagiography, nor a polemic. It is a historical and theological inquiry. Who was Muhammad, according to the traditions that remember him, and how did the events of his life produce a movement that would, centuries later, transform the lands of the Persian empires into the Islamic Iran we recognize today? Long before empires fought over Mesopotamia and Persia, the Arabian Peninsula was a landscape of clans, caravans, and competing gods. The peninsula in the 6th century CE was not a blank slate. It was a crossroads. Caravan routes threaded south to the wealthy markets of Yemen and north to the Byzantine and Sassanid frontiers. Cities such as Mecca, Makkah, functioned as commercial hubs and pilgrimage centers. At the heart of Mecca stood the Kaaba, a cubic shrine that housed an array of sacred objects and images, a focal point for diverse tribal devotions. Pilgrims came, goods exchanged hands, and poets and merchants shaped a culture intensely tied to kinship, honor, and reputation. Arabian society then was decentralized. Loyalties followed family and clan rather than a central government. This tribal fragmentation produced both fierce local loyalties and recurring cycles of raiding and vendetta, but it also fostered a vibrant commercial culture. Meccan elites from the Quraysh tribe controlled much of the trade and benefited from the Kaaba's religious traffic. Religiously, the peninsula was predominantly polytheistic. Rituals and idols were integrated into social life, and sacred ancestry and oral tradition shaped moral authority. At the same time, the wider region pressed in. To the northwest, the Byzantine Christian world. To the northeast and east, the Sassanid Persian Empire with its Zoroastrian establishment. Both exerted military and cultural influence. Christian and Jewish communities existed in Arabia alongside nomadic and pagan groups, and monotheistic ideas circulated in the margins. The religious tapestry of the peninsula was, therefore, varied enough to allow for new claims of religious reform or renewal to find listeners. Into this world, Muhammad was born, around 570 CE, according to Islamic tradition, into the clan of Banu Hashim, a branch of the Quraysh. Tradition records that he was orphaned young, losing his father before birth and his mother in childhood, and that his early years were shaped by care from his grandfather and then an uncle, Abu Talib. These biographical details have been preserved in the traditional sources as part of the backdrop of his character, a precarious childhood that may have cultivated both self-reliance and a sensitivity to social vulnerability. As a young man, Muhammad worked in commerce and gained a reputation among his contemporaries for honesty and trustworthiness. The sobriquet Al-Amin, the trustworthy, is how later tradition describes him. Traders from Mecca traveled the caravan routes to the Levant and Yemen. These journeys connected Arabia to the world and exposed its merchants to competing systems of faith and law. It was in that commercial milieu that Muhammad met Khadija, a wealthy widow who employed him in trading ventures. Tradition records that Khadija recognized his integrity, proposed marriage, and provided not only domestic stability, but also substantial economic support. Her patronage, as narrated in the sources, matters. Khadija appears as the first believer in Muhammad's revelation and as his steadfast ally during the earliest, most perilous years. In those years, Muhammad also sought periods of solitude. He withdrew from the bustle of Meccan society to the cave on Mount Hira, a short distance from the city, where tradition says he spent nights in prayer, reflection, and meditation. These retreats suggest someone wrestling with weighty questions: the meaning of justice in a fractious society, the presence of the divine in a world of competing claims, and the human longing for order and covenant. Whether one reads these withdrawals as religious yearning, intellectual searching, or psychological need, they set the scene for what the Islamic tradition will later name as a prophetic encounter. According to Islamic sources, around 610 CE, an event occurred that would mark a decisive new chapter. In the cave of Hira, Muhammad experienced an encounter with the angel Gabriel, who commanded him to recite, a directive that, in Arabic, gives us the term through which the Muslim scripture is known, Quran, literally recitation. The earliest revelations are traditionally said to have emphasized the oneness of God, Tawheed, the accountability of human beings, care for the poor and orphaned, and a call to moral seriousness. Those who preserve these accounts describe a man overwhelmed by the experience, unsure of his own capacity to bear such a responsibility, and turning repeatedly to Khadija for counsel. It is crucial to mark how historians and the Islamic tradition approach this episode differently. The tradition records the visionary event as real and revelatory, a foundational claim of faith. Secular historians, approaching the materials as sources, treat the Hira experience as a datum within Islamic narrative and analyze how reports about early revelations developed in the decades after Muhammad's death. Where tradition insists on a single, continuous revelation transmitted orally and later written down, many scholars note that the recording and compilation of those recitations into the Quranic codex occurred over time and under particular historical pressures. Both approaches matter for understanding the religious self-understanding of Muslims and the historical processes by which a movement produces authoritative texts. When Muhammad began to proclaim his message in Mecca, the city's elite reacted with suspicion and, in many quarters, hostility. A new claim that challenged the legitimacy of the multiple gods of the Kaaba undercut not only religious practice, but also the economic benefits that pilgrimage traffic conferred on local leaders. Islamic tradition records that early converts were often the marginalized, members of weaker clans, the poor and slaves, people with the least social standing and therefore most receptive to promises of divine justice. Members of Muhammad's own family and household and some of Khadija's circle are named in the traditional lists of earliest believers. Opposition from the Meccan leaders took several forms. Some sought to argue with Muhammad, to discredit him publicly, to pressure his followers socially and economically, or to accuse him of madness or of fabricating miracles. Persecution escalated. Certain households with strong conversions bore the brunt of these measures. Tradition records a boycott, an economic and social withholding imposed by some factions against Muhammad's supporters, designed to force them into submission or exile. The hardship was severe and demonstrated that religious innovation in Mecca was not a private affair. It raised stakes that bound belief to political and economic survival. Two deaths traditionally recorded as occurring around 619 CE, those of Khadija and of Abu Talib, who had offered protection as Muhammad's uncle and patron, mark a turning point the tradition calls the Year of Sorrow. Whether or not historians can verify every detail, the loss of protective kin and a supportive spouse in such a context would have dramatically altered Muhammad's position in Meccan society. It intensified the tension between him and those who saw his movement as a threat to the established order. Faced with mounting pressures, some of Muhammad's followers sought refuge elsewhere. Tradition notes a migration to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, where a Christian king is said to have offered protection, an episode that both shows the reach of Meccan trade and diplomacy networks and underscores religious complexity in the region. These early migrations indicate that the nascent movement had not yet found a secure base in which to survive and grow. By the early 620s, a more definitive opportunity appeared. The inhabitants of Yathrib, a city later known as Medina, al-Madinah, were experiencing internal strife among its tribal factions and invited Muhammad to mediate. Islamic sources describe a series of delegations from Yathrib who offered him terms, a role as an arbiter whose religious authority would be paired with political and legal jurisdiction. This invitation was far more consequential than earlier responses. It represented a chance not merely to preach, but to govern, to shape the social order through binding agreements. In 622 CE, what the tradition calls the Hijra, or Hegira, Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Yathrib, took place. This move is conventionally marked as the beginning of the Islamic calendar and is the clearest turning point from prophet among kin to head of a communal polity. Historians emphasize that migration is transformative in any religious movement. It relocates the center of gravity and forces the adaptation of spiritual claims to the practicalities of law, alliance, and defense. For Muhammad and his followers, the Hijra meant that religious authority would henceforth be exercised alongside political decision-making. The document, often referred to as the Constitution of Medina, is traditionally presented as an early example of community covenant. It defined the rights and duties of diverse groups within the city, set rules for mutual defense, and attempted to bind Muslim converts and existing Jewish and pagan tribes into a single communal framework. The shift from Meccan preacher to Medinan statesman raises an important theological and comparative question that Christian listeners should note. In the New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth is portrayed, in one telling formulation, as eschewing worldly political dominion. My kingdom is not of this world, a theological point I will refer to as a Christian interpretation. Muhammad's trajectory, at least as the tradition records, involves the consolidation of both spiritual and temporal authority. This difference matters for how religious communities imagine the relationship between faith and power. It also helps explain why, over time, the movement that began in the Arabian deserts would take on the organization and capacity of a state apparatus, with all the implications that has for subsequent conquests and integration of other peoples. The early years in Medina saw the Muslim community compelled to defend itself. Conflicts with hostile Meccan factions and later with neighboring tribes tested Muhammad's leadership. Battles traditionally named, such as Badr and Uhud, are described in Islamic accounts as both military engagements and tests of divine favor. Historians treat these battles as formative. Victories and defeats alike shaped notions of communal identity and provided the basis for political legitimacy. Military success, alliance building, and legal rulings together contributed to Muhammad's authority. Small states in tumultuous regions survive or vanish, and the ability to navigate diplomacy and warfare determined whether Muhammad's movement would be a sect or a polity. Yet even as he assumed command in Medina, Muhammad retained a prophetic self-understanding. The revelations he and his followers received continued to address not only spiritual matters but also legal practices, family matters, and community governance, reinforcing the fusion of religion and law. For a Christian observer, this fusion invites reflection. Where does prophetic exhortation end and civil law begin? And what consequences follow when a single leader is both prophet and legislator? Back in Mecca, the balance of power was shifting too. Over the course of years of conflict, negotiation, and intermittent truces, Muhammad's position strengthened. Tradition records a final return to Mecca in 630 CE, when he entered the city with a large following and a policy of reconciliation toward many of his former opponents. The Kaaba was cleansed of images that tradition regarded as inconsistent with monotheism, and pilgrimage practices were reoriented around a new doctrinal center. The conquest of Mecca is narrated as the moment when religious legitimacy and political control converged decisively in the Arabian heartland. These events, the revelation in a cave, the round of persecutions in Mecca, the migration to Medina, the formation of a covenantal community, and eventual takeover of Mecca, constitute the core narrative of Muhammad's life as preserved by Islamic tradition. They also form the template by which later expansion was imagined, a community forged in conflict, consolidated by law and alliances, and capable of carrying its beliefs outward. When we speak of these developments, we must keep two frames in view. First, the traditional Muslim account describes these occurrences as the fulfillment of prophetic mission and divine will. Second, historical scholarship reads the same episodes as social and political transformations set against the background of 7th century Near Eastern dynamics. Tribal loyalties, imperial rivalries between Byzantium and Sassanid Persia, and the economic incentives of controlling trade routes and sacred sites. Both frames are necessary for a rounded understanding. It is at this juncture, newly secure in Medina, but still contending with external threats and the eyes of neighboring empires, that Muhammad's movement was prepared for outward expansion. The consolidation in Arabia provided the military organization, ideological cohesion, and institutional practices that would later become instruments of wider conquests. How, then, did an Arabian prophetic movement reach as far as the Persian plateau? That question will require us to follow campaigns, to examine encounters at places like Al-Qadisiyah and Ctesiphon, and to consider how conversion and cultural adaptation proceeded in Persian lands. But before we go there, we must linger on the internal logic of Muhammad's leadership. Muhammad, as the traditions portray him, was simultaneously teacher, judge, commander, and diplomat. He issued directives on personal morality and communal obligations. He negotiated treaties. He authorized punishments. He presided over worship and ritual. This concentration of roles is important for understanding later developments. When a single office combines spiritual authority with executive power, decisions about law, theology, and foreign policy become intertwined. For those who would later govern diverse territories, the model provided both precedent and toolkit. Caliphal authority, if imagined as successor to Muhammad's office, could claim legitimacy by pointing to the Prophet's example of fused roles. A moment of reflection. Christians studying these dynamics should be careful not to read the Muslim experience through only one lens. It is a Christian interpretation to contrast Muhammad's leadership model with the New Testament portrait of Christ, but that contrast must not become caricature. Both traditions are complex, and both produce diverse theological voices. What matters for our inquiry is how Muhammad's career, as recorded in tradition, explains the mechanisms by which an Arabian religious movement became a governing force, and how those mechanisms shaped later encounters with the Persian world. The migration to Medina also marks a shift in the content of revelation as reported. Communal laws addressing marriage, inheritance, prayers, fasting, and warfare appear alongside guidance on conscience and worship. The legalization of social relations allowed the community to function coherently as a polity. Practical dilemmas: how to integrate recent converts, how to adjudicate disputes with Jewish tribes in Medina, how to administer spoils of war, required settled answers. Revelations that addressed these issues were incorporated into the community's moral matrix, strengthening the bond between doctrine and daily governance. These developments produced a new kind of religious imagination, one in which Scripture provided not only hope for the afterlife, but immediate prescriptions for civic life. Over time, this orientation would have consequences beyond Arabia. When Muslim forces reached regions with long-standing imperial institutions like Sassanid Persia, they encountered administrative systems and cultural traditions that necessitated accommodation, negotiation, and often a reconfiguration of how authority and religion coexisted. But before following those armies eastward, we should recognize a human dimension to Muhammad's story. Tradition presents him as a man who laughed and wept, who felt grief and joy, who negotiated with rival leaders, and who made personal sacrifices. He appears as a figure both charismatic and fallible, operating in an age of precarious loyalties. Such a portrait helps explain why many contemporaries followed him. Leadership that combined moral teaching with concrete settlement of disputes offered stability in a turbulent world. Still, questions multiply. What were Muhammad's motivations? How much did spiritual conviction drive him, and how much did political necessity shape his decisions? Historians caution against monocausal explanations. Religious conviction and political situational pressures often act together, and leaders rarely act from pure motives alone. For the Christian apologist and the historical scholar alike, the task is to distinguish between what the tradition claims and what can be reconstructed from context and evidence, and then to interpret those reconstructions theologically. We are now at a hinge in the narrative. The hijrah has been accomplished, a new community has been formed, legal structures and military capacities have been forged. The shift from a persecuted band in Mecca to a governing body in Medina set the stage for the larger story. The military campaigns into Syrian and Persian territories, the fall of Sassanid power, and the long, uneven process by which Persian society absorbed and transformed Islamic belief, eventually producing a Persianate Islamic civilization distinctively shaped by its own history, languages, and over time the crystallization of Shia identity in certain regions. But that eastward turn is not automatic. It is contingent upon the particular choices of Muhammad and his immediate successors. To understand why Muslim forces moved into Persia, which battles mattered strategically, and how Persian institutions and religious traditions responded, we must trace the contours of leadership, the treaties and truces that preceded campaigns, and the perceptions of opportunity and threat among leaders on both sides. We must also pay attention to the cultural exchanges that followed conquest. Language, law, administrative practices, and theological debates all traveled along with the movement of armies. Before entering that field, it is worth pausing to acknowledge how the story of Muhammad, whether read as sacred history or as human chronicle, produces different interpretive outcomes. For believers in the Islamic tradition, Muhammad's life is a model of prophethood and divine guidance. For historians, it is a case study in state formation, lawmaking, and communal identity. For Christian observers interested in apologetics and comparative theology, his life raises questions about revelation, authority, and the place of religion in public life. Each perspective yields insights and blind spots. Together, they provide a more textured account. As we prepare to follow the footsteps that lead from the Arabian heartland to the Persian plateau, keep in mind the central contrast that will frame much of our analysis. A prophetic movement that becomes a polity carries different kinds of authority than a movement that remains primarily spiritual. That institutional transformation explains why the religion associated with Muhammad did not remain a private piety, but became an organizing principle for states, including in later centuries the Iran, that would develop its own theological and political configurations. And so the story moves onward. The preacher who found refuge in Medina, now faced the strategic realities of neighboring empires and rival tribes, choices about diplomacy and war that would determine whether his movement remained a local sect or became an imperial force. In the next phase, the battles, alliances, and administrative choices would determine the fate of the Sassanid realm and shape Persia's religious future. The decisions made in Medina did not remain confined to the narrow valleys of the Hijaz. They set in motion institutions and habits of alliance-making, administration, and military organization that would, within a few decades, carry Arab arms and Arab law across deserts and rivers into territories long governed by imperial capitals. If the early Muslim community provided the organizational template, the years after Muhammad's death resolved whether that template would be exported or collapse under the weight of succession disputes and external pressures. If you find this exploration useful, and you want more deep-dive histories that connect scripture, theology, and geopolitics, hit like and subscribe. There's more material coming that follows these same threads. Muhammad died in 632 CE, according to Islamic tradition, leaving a community that had been transformed from a persecuted band in Mecca to a polity centered on Medina. Tradition and historical reconstruction both stress a key issue that immediately confronted the community: succession. The question of who would lead the community, how spiritual authority and political command would be handed on, was not a mere matter of bureaucracy. It shaped the very character of the polity that would confront neighboring empires. Islamic tradition records that Abu Bakr, a close companion and early convert, was chosen as the first caliph, Khalifa, literally successor or vicegerent, followed by Umar ibn al-Khattab. Historians note that Abu Bakr's selection reflects how early Muslims sought continuity in communal leadership, prioritizing a figure who could preserve unity. Under Abu Bakr and then Umar, who became caliph in 634 CE, military campaigns resumed and then accelerated. The campaigns were driven by a mixture of motives: defensive responses to ongoing threats, opportunities presented by rival imperial weakness, and the organizational momentum of a newly disciplined polity. Whatever the precise mix, the result was rapid expansion. Against the backdrop of the Byzantine-Sassanid rivalry, the Persian-Sasanian Empire entered the 7th century exhausted by decades of war with Byzantium, internal dissent, and a series of political crises, including rapid turnover of rulers and a plague that weakened military capacities. Historians suggest that this context, imperial exhaustion and fractured local loyalties, created openings that a disciplined and motivated Arab cavalry corps could exploit. At key moments, local Persian magnates and frontier communities found alternatives to central Sasanian rule attractive, or simply lacked the resources to mount effective resistance. One decisive encounter in this eastward movement was the battle traditionally called Al-Qadisiyah, around 636 CE. Sources differ on details, and scholars caution that precise troop numbers and the choreography of the fight are debated, but both Muslim tradition and later historiography portray Al-Qadisiyah as the strategic breach of the Sassanid defensive line in Mesopotamia. The road to the Sassanid capital, Ctesiphon, Madain, lay open. The fall of Ctesiphon, whose palaces and administrative apparatus symbolized Sassanid authority, is conventionally dated to the late 630s. Again, historians emphasize contingency, internal Sassanid divisions, local defections, and the maneuverability of Arab armies all contributed. The Arab incursions did not uniformly impose immediate conversion or cultural eradication. Rather, they substituted a new political order while often preserving many administrative mechanisms of the old empire. What followed conquest was not a monolithic process of abrupt Islamization. In the newly subjugated Iranian lands, conversion to Islam generally proceeded slowly and unevenly over centuries. Early Islamic governance often relied on pragmatic arrangements. Local elites could retain positions of power if they accepted the new rulers and agreed to the tributary framework, including the imposition of a poll tax, jizya, on non-Muslim subjects. Persian administrative talent, especially in tax collection and provincial governance, was frequently retained because the conquerors lacked a ready bureaucracy to replace it. Persian language, culture, and social structures did not vanish. They adapted. Over generations, Persian elites both adopted Islam and reinterpreted it through Persian literary, theological, and administrative lenses, producing a distinctly Persianate Islamic civilization. This long-term cultural negotiation included intellectual and religious exchanges. Zoroastrian communities, Christian churches, Jewish congregations, and various local cults confronted a new ruling ideology that claimed universal norms. In many regions, conversion to Islam could be stimulated by social incentives, reduced taxes, political advantages, or the desire for social mobility. But the conversion process also reflected spiritual attraction and theological dialogue. The transformation was therefore both structural and personal. The governing system changed hands, and over time, millions in the Persian lands came to adopt an Islamic identity that merged with, rather than replaced, Persian civilizational continuities. A central religious development that shaped Persia's later identity was the rise and crystallization of Shi'ism, Shia Islam, in the Iranian plateau. The initial rift that produced the Sunni-Shia division traces to debates over rightful succession after Muhammad's death, whether leadership belonged to the community's consensus or to the Prophet's kin, particularly his cousin and son-in-law Ali. Those disputes took political form across the caliphates, but specific events, most notably the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, where Hussein ibn Ali, a grandson of Muhammad, was killed, contributed powerful martyr narratives that resonated in Persian religious imagination. Over the centuries, especially under the Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates, certain Persian communities found in the Shia emphasis on the sanctity and suffering of the Prophet's family, a compelling alternative to the dominant Sunni orthodoxy. The consolidation of Twelver Shi'ism as the dominant form of Islam in Iran was neither immediate nor inevitable. It was a long historical process shaped by theology, politics, and identity. Crucially, the Safavid dynasty's rise in the early 16th century, around 1501 CE, marks the political turning point at which Shi'ism was made the state religion of a territorial Iranian polity, a policy that had profound cultural consequences. It institutionalized the clerical hierarchy, created new rituals of public piety centered on martyrdom, and differentiated Iran from most of the Sunni Muslim world. This Safavid officialization demonstrates how state power and religious identity can mutually reinforce one another, an analytic theme that echoes back to Muhammad's own fusion of religious and political roles as recorded in the early sources. Throughout this broader sweep, two methodological cautions remain important. First, when we recount battles like Al-Qadisiyah or the fall of Ctesiphon, we are combining traditions that preserve collective memory with historical reconstruction. We must acknowledge uncertainty where sources conflict. Second, when we describe conversion and cultural transformation, we must avoid teleological narratives that depict the Persian past as merely a stage toward a homogeneous Islamic present. Persia's language, literature, and administrative practices persisted, and in many cases, shaped Islamic culture itself. Persian historians, poets, and theologians would later write in Arabic and Persian, producing hybrid intellectual traditions that enriched Islamic civilization. Returning to theological contrasts that bear on how we interpret Muhammad's role and the subsequent political uses of religion, Christian reflection has often emphasized the distinctive portraits of authority in the two traditions. In Christian interpretation, Jesus' mission is frequently read as spiritually focused, with statements attributed to him, such as, "My kingdom is not of this world." A Christian theological reading of John 18:36, emphasizing a distinction between spiritual vocation and political domination. In Muslim tradition, and as the early Islamic record presents him, Muhammad's role combined spiritual revelation with practical governance. He led armies, mediated treaties, and issued communal regulations. For Christian listeners, this difference invites a careful theological conversation about the relationship between faith and state, prophetic vocation, and civic power. It is vital, however, to hold this comparison in balance. It is a Christian interpretive move to frame Jesus primarily as otherworldly and Muhammad as political, and that framing has analytical payoff when explaining how religious movements institutionalize. But we must also recognize that early Christianity itself negotiated political realities. Think of Constantine's conversion and the later Christianization of Roman institutions, and that Jesus' teachings generated complex social implications for followers who lived in a world of empires. Comparative theology benefits from nuance. Each tradition contains multiple strands, and historical outcomes reflect more than doctrinal distinctives alone. They unfold in conversation with social structures, military force, and human agency. How then do these historical facts help explain why modern Iran looks the way it does? First, the arrival of Islam in Persia created a new set of public norms that, over centuries, were interpreted through Persian lenses. Persian administrative continuity allowed the new rulers to govern effectively, while Persian intellectual traditions shaped Islamic historiography, poetry, and theology. Second, the eventual predominance of Shiism in Iran produced distinctive institutional arrangements, a clerical class with interpretive authority, a culture of public grieving and martyrdom, and a political theology that in certain eras has fused religious authority with state prerogatives. The result is that the faith that rules Iran cannot be understood simply as a foreign implant. It is the product of long reciprocal processes of conquest, conversion, adaptation, and state formation. Yet it is equally important to avoid deterministic accounts. The existence of Islam, and later of Shiism, as the dominant religious umbrella in Iran does not erase the persistence of Persian identity, nor does it render every political decision a straightforward implementation of religious doctrine. Modern Iranian politics is shaped by nationalism, social reform movements, economic factors, and international geopolitics as much as by theology. The history we have sketched explains contours and deep structures, not every contingency of contemporary policy. From a Christian apologetic perspective, reflecting on Muhammad's life and the historical trajectory to Iran offers both challenge and opportunity. The challenge is to understand a powerful religious movement on its own terms, to read Muslim tradition with charitable accuracy, while scrutinizing claims where historical reconstruction demands it. The opportunity lies in clarifying theological differences in ways that deepen Christian self-understanding. Contrasting models of revelation, Quran as a corpus of discourses received and recited by one man versus the Bible as a canonical collection of writings composed, redacted, and interpreted across communities and centuries, raises questions about authority, transmission, and the role of communal memory. These are not merely academic concerns. They shape how communities form ethics, law, and identity. A practical theological question emerges. How should Christians engage a religious tradition whose founder embodied both prophetic and political authority? One response is to pursue informed charity. Study Muslim texts, understand historical contexts, and engage in dialogue that recognizes difference without erasing conviction. Another partisan but constructive posture is apologetic. Christians can use the historical comparison to reflect on the uniqueness of the Christian gospel, its claims about Christ's person and work, and to refine how those claims are communicated in contexts shaped by competing religious imaginations. There are several concrete lessons for interpreters who want to avoid shallow caricature. First, historicize claims. When a source says, "Muhammad did X," ask whether the source is a later tradition, a near-contemporary report, or the result of historiographical shaping. Use qualifiers such as tradition records or historians suggest, where appropriate. Second, attend to continuities. Persian culture did not dissipate with the Arab conquests. It re-emerged transformed and influential within Islamic civilization. Third, separate theological critique from cultural contempt. One can disagree theologically with Islamic claims while honoring the dignity of those who adhere to them and appreciating their historical achievements. Before closing, some readers will ask, how did the memory of Muhammad stay authoritative across centuries and regions so far from Arabia? The answer is multi-layered. Authority was maintained through ritual practice and textual transmission. Prayer formulas, the annual fast of Ramadan, pilgrimage to Mecca, and the recited Quran created a shared religious grammar. Institutional structures, mosques, scholarly networks, and later madrasas transmitted legal and theological norms. Political patronage and state endorsement often enhanced particular schools of thought. When Persian rulers, intellectuals, and communities engaged with Islam, they did so through institutions that reproduced memory and practice. The reproduction of ritual life, coupled with administrative and cultural incentives, stabilized the religion across long distances. Finally, what do we do with this story when we return to our own commitments as Christians? History invites humility. Understanding Muhammad as both a religious founder and a political leader explains how the faith associated with his name could become a governing principle in places like Iran. It does not in itself settle theological disputes. Those require theological argument and scriptural exegesis. But historically informed apologetics can be a bridge to meaningful conversation. It enables Christians to speak about religious difference intelligently, to defend Christian convictions with clarity, and to embody a gospel that attends to both spiritual truth and public life. The life that began in Hijaz, the movements that crossed the rivers of Mesopotamia, and the centuries in which Persian pens wrote and translated, debated and codified. This is the long route from a solitary cave on Mount Hira to the religious contours of modern Iran. Muhammad, as tradition presents him, is central to that story because he gave expression to a set of convictions and institutional practices that could be transmitted and adapted. Whether one approaches that figure as a believer in his prophetic office or as a historian interested in causation, the fact remains. The interplay of revelation, political organization, and cultural exchange produced results whose echoes are visible in geopolitics, liturgy, law, and identity even today. If you want to go deeper, the channel offers a study pack that walks through primary sources and accessible secondary scholarship on these topics. Links and resources are in the description for members and those who sign up. For now, let this serve as an invitation. Read the texts, examine the contexts, and bring both scripture and history into the conversation. Understanding the man behind a faith that helped shape Iran does not only clarify the past, it equips us to engage thoughtfully and lovingly with the present.